Ronak Gopaldas is my guest today on Future Cities Africa. He's currently a director at Signal Risk, an exclusively African risk advisory firm. His work focuses on the intersection of politics, economics, and business on the continent. Ronak, welcome. Can you give us a quick tour of your background and major highlights? Feel free to include your love of sports.
Thanks, Dan. Good to be with you. Very kind of, I guess, fortuitous path to ending up doing what I do. I used to joke and say that I'm a corporate sangoma, and say that I try and kind of predict the future and help investors, understand the risks and the opportunities and think ahead. Obviously, I don't, always get it right, but I guess our job as analysts is to provide a framework to help people to make better decisions. In terms of my academic background, I've kind of always had a keen interest in current affairs, in news. Thought I might be a journalist, but by default ended up in banking, which was kind of quite accidental, but really enjoyed it. I studied politics, philosophy, and economics at university in Cape Town. Did a postgrad in financial analysis and portfolio management, and I have a master's in economics as well. With a PPE degree, my friends thought it stood for party, etc. It was actually politics, philosophy, and economics. But I was quite lucky in the sense that I ended up doing almost exactly what I studied, and I got really lucky in that regard. Then spent around 8 years at Rand Merchant Bank, and for the past 3 years I've been working at Signal Risk with a kind of portfolio approach to my career, really kind of focusing on big themes and trends, with a strong Africa focus as well.
I recently attended an event where African mayors talked about the impact of the pandemic on their local fiscal space. That's just one major challenge. What are the biggest economic challenges currently facing the continent?
So I think to put this in perspective, the continent was really hit by what I call the 3 C's. So number one was obviously COVID. Number two was commodity prices. And number three was capital flight, which had a knock-on effect on the cost of funding and currencies through weakness, which then kind of led to a whole host of issues. Now, what was really interesting from an economic perspective is that we had financial markets effects as well as real economy effects playing out at the same time. We had a downturn in developed economies as well as developing economies, and all sectors across the world, across all industries were badly hit. And Africa obviously has been no exception. We are facing the first recession on the continent in 25 years. So it's quite significant. FDI globally is set to dip to its lowest level since 2005, which is a staggering amount. It's worse than the last financial crisis. So we're getting it on all fronts. From a financial market perspective, we saw a massive sell-off in African Eurobond yields. We saw currency weaknesses, and again, the cost of funding for many African countries became unsustainable. Trade globally has slowed down, which is going to be another shock to the system. And then in terms of the real economic effects, slower growth, less investment, potentially reduced donor support, and a lot of the traditional kind of partners who would have assisted Africa in the past are facing their own specific set of challenges. And I think what this has done is really brought the biggest issue to the fore, which is the issue of debt. And I've touched briefly on the issue of the cost of funding, and most African countries have a really, really unenviable dilemma over here, because they're faced with either paying their external creditors or spending the money on their domestic populations. The policy war chest, the fiscal and monetary levers are extremely weak, very narrow tax bases, and with commodity price declines, there's very little by way of domestic funding that they can muster up. So what's happened is that most African countries are now faced with this dilemma. The continent as a whole this year owes about $40 billion in debt to external creditors, half of which are owed to private creditors. So, this is creating a big issue, and we're in the midst of this gridlock. Over the weekend, Zambia announced that it's the first African country that's going to default on its sovereign debt obligations, and this is creating a lot of anxiety and a lot of worry in the eyes of investors who fear that this is going to have a knock-on effect, that's going to have a contagionary impact. And given the acute development needs and the need to spend on healthcare, on education, to kind of catalyze the demographic dividend that the continent has. This really could be a massive setback if these very limited resources already are strained and we get a series of defaults. So for me, that's the big thing that keeps me up at night. And I think the continent now has to navigate the 3Ds, which is disease, debt, and dysfunction.
Hopefully we can start doing that quite soon. I know that there's predictions that by 2100, 8 of the largest cities will be in Africa. And they're talking about mega cities with 50 million people per city. What are your views on that? How do we get there?
Yeah, I think, the very unique situation that Africa finds itself in is that it needs to industrialize, but it needs to industrialize under two very unique sets of circumstances. So one, it's being asked to industrialize and democratize simultaneously, but also this is happening in a context of premature deindustrialization. So what the African continent needs to do is to effectively create a path to industrialization that's never been done before. We can't follow the route that the Asian tigers did. We don't really have the comparative advantage in manufacturing, and China's kind of got that kind of sewn up already. So we need to think creatively and think quite differently. And for me, we need to think smart and strategically. And there's this concept that Shane Snow talks about in his book, Smart Cuts. And I think we really need to hack the ladder to success and think about how we're going to do this. We've obviously got significant comparative advantage in terms of our labor force, our young population. Africa, is largely regarded as virgin territory in terms of investment. And this can potentially be a great economic stimulus and a catalyst which could unlock a virtuous cycle of growth, urbanization, provided our young people are healthy and are educated and economically productive. But at the moment, the issue is that the governance is not up to speed. The rate at which these people are coming into the workforce but are lacking opportunities there's a mismatch over there, and I think that's the circle that we're going to need to square from a policy and a governance perspective. For me, I think the best hope is through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, because this presents us with a vision. It's a continental wide agreement. I think it plays to our strengths, which is our population, the fact that if we work together as a collective, we're able to achieve size, scale, gravitas. It leverages sectors that I think are under development, where we have comparative advantage in terms of kind of the agriculture space as an employment sector, using technology as well. The digital landscape, I think, is completely undertapped. And I think, catalyzing regional trade as well. So it's not rocket science. I think what we need to do now is just really understand what our strengths are and leverage these, because otherwise, instead of being a big boon, it's the demographics are going to be a disaster, and we're going to have swathes of young people coming into the workforce who are not only unemployed but unemployable, which then leads to kind of seeking opportunities outside state structures and conventional employment opportunities. And this is where your Boko Harams, your Al-Shabaabs of this world start to emerge as viable alternatives. And that's a situation that would be untenable. So, I think the point to stress here is that we've got a massive conundrum. We need to solve for this issue of politics of the stomach to get our young people clothed, fed, educated, economically productive, so that they can become an asset and lead to kind of greater economic growth, greater economic prosperity, and more inclusive societies. And the hope is that happens, but at the moment, there's not much good news out there.
The leaders of China and another 14 countries in the Asia-Pacific region have recently signed one of the biggest free trade deals in history, and that during the pandemic. Will the African Continental Free Trade Agreement survive the pandemic?
I think that's a great question, particularly as you've got this kind of ongoing tension between the future of kind of globalization versus protectionism and which way the world is going to go. And for me, I think this should really catalyze the integration project now more than ever. And I think in that regard, policymakers in terms of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement have approached it the right way. They've been pragmatic. They've understood that the initial timelines were not going to be sustainable. They've shifted those out because they've understood that governments were diverting all available resources to firefighting effectively on the healthcare and the economic front. So I think, they've been pragmatic, they've kind of revised timelines, but they've also been very careful to retain momentum regarding the agreement so as to not have it fade away into obscurity. And I think this was the delicate dilemma that they had to wrestle with. Do they push ahead? Do they abort? Do they postpone? And they've decided to postpone. But there has been progress maintained. We've had the Secretariat officially launched. Afri-Exim Bank has come to the party with funding instruments to help smooth this transition. And I think, the message coming through from the Secretariat is that the political momentum is there. I think, though, there are going to be three fundamental tensions that need to be resolved in order to make this a success. So, number one, you've got these kind of this tension between a Pan-African vision and an integration project, but also the domestic politics of certain countries, where you're seeing protectionist impulses in places like Nigeria. We know that they shut their border with Benin. In Tanzania, same story. You've got xenophobic issues in South Africa. So how do you kind of reconcile this kind of broader overarching vision, which is going to require some kind of domestic concessions, versus the domestic and nationalistic impulses that you're seeing, which is potentially an argument for increased sovereignty? And we've seen this kind of in the Brexit argument, in other continents as well. So that's going to be one of the tricky bits to resolve. The other one is kind of making sure that the smallest countries are protected, because otherwise, it's going to be disproportionate. Again, we've seen this in Europe, where effectively, a lot of the larger countries get all the benefits, and the smaller countries are neglected. And this actually exacerbates the lack of equality, leads to productivity differentials, and widens divisions. And then the last kind of issue to resolve, I think, is to resolve this tension between what's happening on a technocratic level and what's happening on a political level versus what's happening for the man on the street. Because this is it's a very sexy technocratic agreement that everybody kind of talking about, hanging their hopes on. But for the man on the street, this needs to deliver tangible economic progress. It needs to materially change the quality of his life. And I think, selling that message and reconciling that top-down versus the bottom-up approach is another issue. I mean, of course, it's got huge potential. If it works, it's going to be the largest free trade area in the world, an economy of $2.5 trillion, 1.2 billion people. I don't care who you are, whether you're wherever you're sitting in the world, that's too big to ignore. So I think, that's I think, the great hope. I think obviously it's quite aspirational, and we need to bear that in mind, but I think it gives us a collective vision to work towards. And I think what's quite exciting about this is that it's an African solution to an African problem. It leverages the low-hanging fruit. There's the political momentum, as I've mentioned, and also, as I've mentioned, the size and the scale of it all. So I don't think that it's going to be linear progression. I don't think it's going to be all smooth sailing. You're going to have hiccups, tensions, but for Africa, which through the AU has traditionally been slow, cumbersome, bureaucratic, I think there's been significant progress that we need to acknowledge, and it gives us something to work towards. So, I think if the momentum can be maintained, I think it will certainly be a positive and improve the ease of doing business, reduce the cost of doing business. And I think the integration project, at a time where global alliances are fragmenting, where isolationist impulses are on the rise, I think Africa needs to realize that its power is as a collective, and it needs to rely on itself and bet on itself rather than rely on external forces or external powers.
There's criticism of probably every government when it comes to the pandemic and the handling of it. How has Africa managed the pandemic relative to other regions of the world?
So I think obviously a mixed bag, because Africa is not a country. You've got 54, 55 different countries depending on your classification. And I think there's obviously been some good, some bad, and some ugly. But I think generally speaking, if you look at the fatality rate relative to other regions of the world, the continent's done quite well. Whether that's through skill or luck, I would argue it's a combination of both. Just looking at some of the conditions in its favor, the virus got here later than most regions in the world. We've got younger populations which are less susceptible. The climatic conditions are more favorable as well. We've also got experience in dealing with contagious disease outbreaks. But that's not to say that we didn't do things properly. There are a number of countries that instituted early lockdowns, which had strong public support, travel restrictions, curfews. There was compliance with the rule of law, and I think realizing that this is a continent where in some countries you've got more vice presidents than you do ventilators, and in some countries you've got more members of parliament than you do ICU beds. We didn't really have an option but to get it right. But this is something that's confounded expectations, particularly in the Western media, who are asking why aren't more Africans dying. So you could make there'll be some cynicism to say that the testing and the tracing is not to the extent it is elsewhere. But I think we did have the favorable conditions, but then also we've managed the pandemic well. And I think that's evidenced through countries like Rwanda, like Senegal, like Ghana, like Mauritius, which were able to kind of withstand the healthcare fallout quite well. The economic fallout, of course, as we've discussed already, is a different story entirely. I think also, you've seen some really, really good stuff coming through on a regional level through the Africa CDC, which has convened meetings of the healthcare ministers in various countries. They've lent technical and operational and logistical support to the countries that have been most vulnerable. The Africa Risk Capacity has activated emergency funding. There's been an Africa Coronavirus Relief Fund that's been activated as well. And from an AU level, there's been strong coordinations, which I think is definitely a progress or a sign of progress. Of course, it hasn't all been plain sailing. You've had some really ridiculous stuff coming out, like in Tanzania, where John Magufuli has said we're going to trust the Bible rather than masks, and has kind of just thrown every bit of protocol with regards to managing a pandemic out of the window. And then in Madagascar, they've kind of put forward that herbal remedy, which has not been through any scientific rigor. So, mixed bag, but on the whole, I would say the continent has done a lot better than people expected. And I think we, on a continent where you often overemphasize the negative news and the bad news, I think it's important to celebrate some of the successes as well.
On the topic of post-pandemic geopolitics, where does Africa feature?
Again, another really interesting question. A lot of uncertainty at the moment. I think the first thing that comes to mind is in terms of this vaccine diplomacy. As we know that this week there's signs of progress. The Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine. We know that the Chinese and the Russians are working on their remedies as well. And I think this is basically going to be the new gold dust, once a vaccine is established, because it carries immense power and immense influence. So I think that's going to be an interesting dynamic to see who effectively wins this race. But beyond that, I think what we're seeing even before the outbreak of COVID is Africa is becoming really important in a new game of geostrategic chess between global superpowers. We know all about the advantages and the prospects of the continent in terms of its resources, its size, its population. But in terms of strategic influence, we most especially have seen significant competition between the US and China. Now, this is interesting because under Trump, what we saw was a very kind of America first approach to international relations and diplomacy. The approach to Africa centered around return on investment. If countries in Africa can offer something to the Trump administration, they'd stand to benefit. For the first 2 years, pretty much, it was a policy of benign neglect where he largely ignored Africa. I think that shifted in 2018. with the launch of Prosper Africa, and where the Trump worldview centered around countering what Russia and China were doing on the continent. And as we know, the US's focus is primarily around security and around commercial activities. And I think it's important to kind of acknowledge that despite the fact that Trump was deeply unpopular on the continent, he did launch a number of initiatives that were actually quite promising. They didn't fulfill their potential, but Prosper Africa was promising. The Build initiative was promising. Recapacitating the US Exim Bank was also a sound idea. And I think the Biden administration would do well to build on a lot of this momentum and playing to US strengths. We're going to see a more multipolar world, which I think, or multipolar approach to geopolitics from the Biden administration, which I think will be positive for the management of the pandemic, for the issue of debt, and for the issue of climate change, which affects Africa quite significantly. So, it's going to be interesting to see how these approaches contrast. But, looking at China, I think, China in Africa, we all know that they've been here for a long time, that they are the preferred partner of African governments because they ask less questions than some of the Western partners, and there's less conditionality. So, what is China going to do now? And there was initially a lot of fear that China would retreat, would look inwards, would focus on its domestic economy to manage the fallout from COVID. This was kind of amplified by the issues around debt trap diplomacy, where we've seen in recent years a lot of controversy around the issue of Chinese loans and the lack of transparency there, where it's alleged that China lends money to countries in a predatory way. It lends money to countries at attractive interest rates, knowing full well that they can't pay it back, and then repossesses strategic assets when these countries can't pay back, and it's unscrupulous business. You get mixed reviews as to whether that's actually accurate or not. But the point is that China views Africa as fundamentally strategic, and this is most clearly evident through the Belt and Road Initiative, which aims to kind of connect the old Silk route, and Africa is fundamental to that in terms of the road and railway infrastructure. I think also in terms of the diplomatic fallout that we had with the attacks on African students in Guangzhou, that's also raised a few eyebrows around whether China is actually different to any of these Western partners in the eyes of Africans. So China's going to have to pull out the stops to mend the relationship that was damaged in regards to these two issues. But I think they will, in terms of healthcare diplomacy, economic diplomacy, the lack of conditionality with which they do things. And this is going to create an interesting kind of polarity or set of choices for African countries who have the one approach, which is largely government to government led, versus the other approach, which is largely centered around the private sector. But it's not only the US and China. Europe is very strongly focused on security and migration. They know that if things go belly up in Africa, they're going to have to deal with an exodus of refugees and migrants, and they want a prosperous, functioning Africa. In that regard, the Russians are expanding their footprint quite aggressively in terms of their military might and their energy diplomacy. The Indians and the Japanese, to counter China, not only within Asia but also in Africa, have come up with their own growth corridor, which is focused on maritime security, maritime investments, and digital connectivity. So there's a lot of interest at the moment in the shakeup, and it's up to African countries to make the right strategic choices to avoid being exploited. And here, I think we've got the choice between being piggy in the middle or kingmaker, and we need to kind of select wisely.
What practical strategies can Africa implement to thrive in the post-pandemic world? And are there any silver linings for the continent?
Yeah, so I think what this pandemic has done is exposed that the old ways of doing things were, in many cases, not fit for purpose, and we've had to kind of come up with more creative, more innovative, and more dynamic approaches to doing things. And I think one of the concepts that I came up with along with Bronwyn Williams was the concept of this 5-color economy, which I think Africa needs to kind of look at to to come out not only surviving, but also to be successful. Now, in a very, very kind of brief summary, we've identified kind of 5 key economic areas. The blue economy, which deals with oceans, tourism, maritime issues, which we believe is underexploited. Africa has about 40,000 kilometers of coastline, 38 island or coastal states. And this is something that I think can be really catalyzed. It can help in terms of employment. It can help in terms of energy security, and it's untapped. So number 1 is the blue economy. The next, quite logically, is the green economy, where, this is something that can address Africa's issues around food security, around renewable energy. Again, significant potential, underdeveloped agricultural potential, has a huge potential employment impact as well. And I think focusing on agriculture, agro-processing, using technologies and integrating this into the African Continental Free Trade Agreement can lead to some significant positive developments in Africa. I think the next one is the purple economy, which not many people actually know about, but this is the cultural economy, which globally represents a $2 trillion economy. If we look at the examples of some of the other countries in the world, Japan and South Korea, which exports K-pop as a cultural kind of product, I think there's significant potential here. And we're already seeing through the likes of Trevor Noah, through the likes of Burna Boy, through the Jerusalem Challenge, through various kind of avenues, there is an appetite for African content, for African cultural content. And I think developing these value chains which allow us to monetize these will be really important, particularly because this has the potential to foster creative industries, to foster innovation, and to employ young people. So that's the purple economy. Moving on, I think the 2 others which I think are really important: the flat white economy, obviously with reference to coffee, but this is the digital economy, and we're seeing significant progress here in the likes of Silicon Savannah, where we're seeing huge innovation coming through to adapt to the 4th industrial revolution. And the hope is that the pandemic accelerates that trend. The last of the 5 colors is the gray economy, which is the informal economy. And I think this is often Africa's dirty little secret. It's underreported. We don't really have the full extent of the data around this. It's estimated that this contributes anywhere between 25 to 65% to the continent's GDP, that it employs anywhere between 50 to 85% of the continent's workforce. So this is clearly a source of great economic activity and potential, but one that needs to be kind of harnessed and channeled properly to become economically productive. And I think here you can use fintech, you can replicate the examples that we've seen in India with the Aadhaar system, where we effectively look to formalize this and to bring this into the kind of fiscal nets and to catalyze opportunities in that regard. So I think that's kind of the last of the 5. We've got, as I mentioned, the blue, the green, the purple, the flat white, and the gray. And I think looking at this kind of this canvas, I think we need to think creatively, differently, if we are going to thrive in this kind of post-COVID world. So, for me, that's the template that I would suggest that we use in order to kind of achieve sustainable, inclusive, and scalable growth.